I'm very pleased to welcome today Chris Redston, face-to-face author. Chris has been a teacher and coursebook writer for 25 years and has taught in Turkey, Argentina, Italy and the UK. He's just completed the second edition of Face-to-Face with his co-author Gilly Cunningham. Over to you, Chris.
Hello everyone. Thank you very much for joining me today from wherever you are in the world. I see from the chat box we have people here from Brazil, Spain, Poland, the UAE, Russia, UK, Qatar, Egypt, Algeria, Italy, Saudi Arabia, Uruguay, all sorts of places. So fantastic. It's really good to see you all, and thank you very much for joining us today. We'll come back to the slide you're looking at in a minute, which was the poll before we started. But first, I'd like to just show you what we're going to be looking at today. So this is an outline of the webinar. Firstly, we're going to be looking at vocabulary and level, then talk about presenting new vocabulary, then principles behind vocabulary practice activities, the problems of teaching lexical grammar, recycling vocabulary, and some vocabulary revision activities. And at the end of the webinar, there'll be time for you to ask your questions. Firstly, though, here's a question for you. How do you decide what vocabulary to teach in class? You can send your answers, if you want to, through the chat box. Okay, according to the level, certainly. Thank you. Based on the student's level, syllabus specified, depends on the learning aims. The syllabus, yes, so the syllabus, and probably the syllabus very much is determined these days by what's in the course book, which of course is completely fine. That's the whole point of having a course book. But have you ever wondered how coursebook writers like myself decide which vocabulary to teach at which level? I'm sure you're all familiar with the English Profile and Common European Framework for Languages reference system for levels, which is on the front of most coursebooks nowadays. Here's the front of our new edition of the Preintermediate Students Book. And here is the English Profile logo in the corner. So what exactly is the English Profile? Basically, the English Profile describes the language that students need to perform the can-do statements from the CEFR. It lists the vocabulary, grammar and functional language that learners typically know at each English Profile level, and is a really useful tool for teachers, teacher trainers, exam writers, and of course, coursebook writers like myself. So when my co-author Gilly and I were writing the second edition of Face-to-Face, we checked all the vocabulary we're teaching against the English Profile to make sure we're teaching the right vocabulary at the right level. We were also very lucky to be able to check this against something called the Cambridge English Corpus, which is a unique database of millions of spoken and written texts, which amounts to billions of words. This incredible resource tells us exactly how frequent words are in spoken or written English. So you can be sure the vocabulary taught in each level of face-to-face is exactly what students are expected to know at that level. So let's have a look at the task that was on screen before the webinar. Okay, we asked you to look at this and decide which uses of get matches the correct English Profile CEFR level, A1, A2, etc. Okay, we're just getting the poll results up now. Okay, let's see how many you got right. Okay, get up. Most people said this should be A1, and let's have a look. A1 it is. Well done. Get off on the wrong foot. That's kind of a spread we have between B1 all the way to C2, but C2 was the most popular. Let's see if that was correct. Exactly, that's a C2 phrase. Get on or off a bus. This seems very strongly, seems to be A2. Again, correct, fantastic. Get to know someone. The most popular on the poll is B1. Again, correct. Get something straight. Let's see what the most popular on the poll. Again, this is going to be to C1 most. C1 was the most popular. And again, correct. And finally, get out of doing something. The most popular was B2. Again, fantastic. So if any of you got all of those correct, congratulations. It kind of shows you have very good instincts about language and level. So that's the kind of work we did before writing the course to decide what goes in which level. So you should be confident that you're teaching the right things at the right level. Okay, now let's have a look at ways we use to present new vocabulary. Again, here's another question for you. Do you prefer presenting new vocabulary yourself, or do you prefer to ask your students to work it out themselves? Okay, we've got some answers coming in now. We asked the students, both a variety, work it out themselves from the content. Gosh, lots of answers coming in now, and lots of both as well. Okay, and as someone's pointed out on here, it prefers a mixture, but sometimes it really depends on the level. And I think that's a key point here, because I think at low levels, particularly at beginner or elementary, it can be a very good way to present vocabulary, to be in front of the class and telling all the class the new vocabulary. Because at that level, most of the vocabulary is new. However, this approach can waste a lot of time if students know a lot of the words, which can be the case particularly at a higher level. So at this level, perhaps a better way to approach teaching vocabulary in class is to make the stage very student-centered and get the students to do the work. One of the problems teachers have when presenting new vocabulary is they don't know how much vocabulary each individual student knows. So in face-to-face, we often start the vocabulary presentation stage by asking students which words or phrases they know. This means students can spend time learning the words they don't know, rather than wasting time listening to you presenting all the words they do know. So here's an example of this approach from the elementary students book, which teaches phrases for free time activities. First, we ask the students to tick the phrases they know. The reason for this approach is to give students a bit of time on their own to process the vocabulary and find out what they know and what they don't know. A little alone time can be a good thing at this stage. The next stage asks the students to do a matching activity in the language summary, which is in the back of the book. They can again do this on their own or in pairs. So students will match this up, and then the teacher checks the answers with the class, deals with any problems, and drills the vocabulary. So overall, we usually use a very student-centered approach that takes pressure off the teacher and challenges all the students. Of course, there are many other ways to test what students already know, depending on the language and the level. Here's a similar example from the Preintermediate students book, which teaches TV nouns and verbs. Here, students work in pairs and try and put the words and phrases in three groups. When they've done the best they can check their answers in the language summary. Here they can check that the groups are correct and also check the meaning of any words or phrases they don't know. Again, this is all very student-centered and time efficient, and the students are doing all the work. Another good method of introducing new vocabulary is to include it in sentences or questions. As people have pointed out in the chat box, giving them a context can often really help them work out the meaning of new vocabulary. Here, students are asked to work in pairs and guess the meaning of the phrasal verbs in bold. The questions give the vocabulary a context and mean students have a better chance of guessing the answers if they don't already know them. Then they're asked to check their ideas in the language summary. So in the back of the book, we have a sort of simplified dictionary giving the meaning. We use some pictures as well, but I don't think you can use pictures to show the meaning of every single word or phrase in English. This approach is much quicker than asking students to look up words in the dictionary, as students only see the meaning that we're teaching them, and the definitions and examples are always written in a language they can understand at this level. So again, this is very time efficient, and the students are doing all the work. And as well as meaning, teaching collocations in English is very important. We sometimes just want to teach students which verbs go with which nouns, i.e. the collocation. So here's an example from Intermediate. Teaching everyday problems, such as oversleep on Monday mornings, or in my case, on Thursday mornings. Get lost, miss a plane, lose your keys, etc. So in this case, students are probably going to know most of the individual words, but it's the collocation they don't know. So for this type of language, we use a matching activity as a good way to test what students know. As there are only 3 phrases in each book, in each group, they can probably work out most of them. Then they check them in the language summary. Here we have the collocations at the top, and then at the bottom are the words or phrases that might be new to them. Again, these have both pictures and definitions to make meaning absolutely clear. So, to sum up, these are the key principles I feel are important for presenting new vocabulary, and these are the principles that we have based the vocabulary presentation sections face-to-face on. Firstly, teacher-led presentations to the whole class can be a very good approach at low levels, such as starter and elementary. At other levels, students often know some of the vocabulary. So we use a student-centered approach there instead. Let them do the work. Firstly, students decide what they know or don't know first. Then they try to work out meaning or collocation from pictures, context, examples, etc. And if they try to work it out themselves, they're much more likely to remember the vocabulary than being passively told it. All research that's been done on language acquisition has shown that students remember things better if they've had a go at working it out themselves, even if they didn't get it all right the first time. Okay, so that's a bit about presentation, but what about practice? Here's another question for you. In a second. Firstly, though, I'm just going to look at what the teacher's role is if it's a student-centered vocabulary presentation. Because sometimes teachers are a bit reluctant to use a very student-centered approach and feel they should always be at the front of the class, teaching. So, what is the teacher's role? Well, firstly, is to organize a class and set up the activity. Then while the students are doing the work, the teacher should be monitoring and helping weaker students during the activity. Then the teacher should be checking the answers for the whole class, if necessary, and dealing with queries. After that, the teacher can highlight problems in meaning, any false friends, etc. These are all listed in the teacher's books. And then the teacher would usually drill the vocabulary and highlight any pronunciation problems. Again, there are tips on this in the teacher's book. So we often use a very student-centered presentation method, which we feel is the most efficient way to present vocabulary. In terms of practice, here's a question for you. Do you always ask your students to practice new vocabulary? Okay, yes, 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 yes. Not always, yes. I try to, they tend to be a bit reluctant. Interesting, yes. Usually, yes, very often. Okay, like can make up sentences, etc. Okay, great. So everyone's saying yes, if possible. Of course, once we have taught some new vocabulary, we really need to make sure that they remember it. And when I was teaching full-time, I was surprised how much, or indeed how little vocabulary students remembered in the next class. And there was a simple reason for this. I was a terrible teacher. No, seriously, the reason students don't remember vocabulary is they don't get to see or use it often enough. When you see something for the first time, it goes into your short-term memory. But unless you see it again quickly, you're probably just going to forget it. So you need to see or use it again and again to move it from your short-term memory to your long-term memory. In short, if you don't use it, you lose it. And I think actually course books are often to blame for this. All course books teach vocabulary, of course, but often there's no vocabulary practice in the course book. You just go straight from the vocabulary presentation into the reading or listening or whatever's next. But how are students going to remember the vocab if they never use it? So a key principle in face-to-face is that vocabulary is always practiced immediately after the presentation stage. Let me show you a few examples of what I mean. Okay, we looked at the student-centered teach stage of these free time activities, phrases, a few minutes ago, which is exercise 1A. So immediately after that, in exercise 1B, students are asked to work in pairs and ask questions in the present simple, using the vocabulary they've just learnt. This immediately personalises the vocabulary, making it more meaningful and easy to remember. With the vocabulary on TV nouns and verbs, after the presentation, students do a quick memory activity. We ask them to close their books, write down all the words and phrases they can remember in 1 minute. Then they work in pairs and compare lists. This kind of very quick memory activity has been shown to be very effective in helping students store vocabulary in their short-term memory. Then they are asked to discuss questions about TV in groups, using the vocabulary they have just learnt. So here we have two very different vocabulary practice activities, one based on memory, one based on personalisation. And then we think students have a much better chance of remembering the vocabulary for the rest of the lesson. You'll remember these questions using phrasal verbs from travel. Well, one of the great things about this type of presentation is that it instantly becomes a practice activity. So in 1B, students work with a new partner and take turns to ask and answer the questions. This also allows them to personalise the vocabulary and is genuinely communicative. So we don't just go from the presentation into the listening, we make sure that there's a little vocabulary practice stage in between. With the everyday problems vocabulary, students are first asked to test each other, which helps students store the collocations in their short-term memory. Then they are asked to tick the phrases they often do or have done in the past. This little bit of alone time gives students an opportunity to connect the phrases to their own lives. Then they compare answers in groups. So again, we've got two activities, one quick memory activity and one personalized activity. It's also a good idea, as some people mentioned on the chat box, to ask students to write questions or sentences with the new vocabulary to ask other students. Here are a couple of quick examples. This exercise from Preintermediate teaches computer vocabulary such as password, backup, hard drive, spam, etc. After they've done that, they're asked to write 5 questions about computers to ask their partners using the vocabulary they've just learned. A couple of examples there on screen. By the way, don't be afraid to give students a bit of alone preparation time before they do speaking activities. This really helps them get their ideas and language sorted and makes the speaking much more successful. Then, after they've written their questions, they work in pairs and ask the questions to their partner, continuing the conversation if they can. So that's looking at questions. With this example, students are taught some phrases for employment in the usual way. Then in B, they're asked to write 5 sentences about their jobs now, or the job they'd like to have in the future. Again, using the phrases. So, in my job, I don't have a good salary, a company car. I like to have a job with opportunity for promotion, etc. So they get a chance to personalize the vocabulary. Then, students compare their ideas in pairs. Of course, if your coursebook doesn't have this kind of vocabulary practice activity immediately after presentation, you can always add them yourself, which is what I used to do for years when I was teaching full-time. It used to drive me crazy to see vocabulary presented, but not practiced in books. And I'm always making little handouts to fill in the gaps of the lesson. But really, who has the time to do that these days? Then, when I got the opportunity to write a course book, it was incredibly satisfying to put these little stages in the book that I always thought should have been there in the first place. So, to sum up the principles of practice activities, we feel that vocabulary practice will be successful if you do it immediately after presentation, make it personalized, so it's about the students or people the students know, make it communicative, so they're actually genuinely communicating with other people in the class. Also important to give students preparation time before they speak. Give them a chance to select some vocab, write sentences or questions, think of ideas, make lists, etc. This little preparation stage really helps the communication stage work successfully. And also to make it fun and challenging for students. Okay, of course, there's more to teaching vocabulary than teaching meaning. So here's another question for you. What do students find most difficult about these 4 verbs? Remember, ask, keep, and promise. Okay, we're getting some answers coming in now. Okay, verb patterns, structure, exactly. Find it difficult to know what to say afterwards, from Fernando. Using the right verb pattern, gerund, or infinitive. Okay, so you've all got the right answer there. But it's about verb patterns. It's not the meaning that's a problem, it's the grammar. So sometimes we have to teach what I call lexical grammar. And here's an example of how we do this with verb patterns such as these. Okay, this is one of our new lessons from Intermediate, which is about birthdays. Firstly, students are asked to read a text about the origins of birthday traditions. For example, why are birthday cakes round? Why do we put candles on them? And why do people give birthday cards? The answers are in the text, and students have to read and find the answers. The reason that they're round was the ancient Greeks decided to make the cakes round so they look like a full moon. And they also put candles on the cake to make them shine like the moon. Okay, so as you might expect, students are asked to read the text twice for content, ordering the pictures, answering questions. And as you can see, some of the verbs are in bold, which leads into the vocabulary stage of the lesson. Students are asked to look at the words in bold in the article and underline the verb form that follows it. Then they write the infinitive form of the verbs in bold in the table. So again, this is a very student-centered approach where they work it out themselves from contextualized examples. Then they're asked to complete the table with other verbs, which they should know at this stage of the course. Then they check in the language summary where there's a completed table. And as you might expect with the face-to-face principles, the very next thing they do is a practice activity. Here students are asked to work in pairs and turn to different pages of the student's book. So this is what's in two different pages on the back of the student's book. First, they do a gap fill activity where they fill in the gaps. Do you enjoy going to birthday parties, etc.? Then they work in pairs and take turns to ask and answer the questions. As we've discussed, we feel students need practice of the vocabulary immediately after doing the work on meaning or form. So our help with vocabulary sections aim is to teach areas of lexical grammar. For that, we feel it's important to present the target language in a clear context. And we also use a guided discovery approach. Students remember things better if they try and work out the rules themselves first. And as you can see, this is a core principle we use throughout face-to-face with all new language. Then we ask students to check the answers in the language summary before checking with the teacher, so they can have a go and check if they're right or not. And they should then be followed immediately by a proper communicative practice activity. Okay, so hopefully that will help them remember it. But here's another question for you. How many times do students need to see or use a new item of vocabulary before they remember it? Okay. Once if they're lucky. I like that one from okay, we've got lots of numbers coming up here. 7 seems to be the most popular, up to 20. Okay. 8, 3 or 4, 5. Okay, lots of ranges there. We got answers from 1 to 20, so which is probably correct. It depends on the students, of course. Some words or phrases stick immediately. Some they kind of never get. And as Sophia says, it depends on the student, but about 5. Depends how much they studied in their home, says Cynthia. Depends on age, interesting, from Victoria, and significance, and how useful they find them. Of course, absolutely. If you don't think it's useful vocabulary, you won't learn it. Which takes us back to the English profile and the Cambridge International Corpus, is that we are trying to teach vocabulary that is definitely useful at that level. Okay, there's been quite a lot of research done on this, and the general consensus is of research has shown that students need to see or use an item of vocabulary between 7 and 10 times in order to move it from their short-term memory to their long-term memory. So part of our job as teachers, and particularly my job as a course book writer, is to make sure that students can see and use the new vocabulary lots of times during a lesson and beyond. And again, this is something when I was teaching full time, I felt never really was done enough in course books. Often the vocabulary was just taught at the beginning and forgotten about. But we've tried to do this a lot more in face-to-face, so let me show you what I mean with a lesson from Intermediate? Okay, this is a lesson called Make Up Your Mind, and here we're teaching phrases with make and do, which are always a problem for some students. So firstly, they're asked to decide whether we use make or do with these phrases, then check in the language summary. So do the cleaning, make a decision, do a course, make a mistake, not do a mistake, etc. So first they try and do that, then they check in the language summary. Then we ask them to take turns to test each other on the collocations. Thirdly, exercise 2 asks them to fill in the gaps with the correct form of make and do in these questions. Then they ask other students the questions using the simple find someone who format. So they have to find one person who answers yes to each question. So by this stage of the lesson, they've already seen or used the new vocabulary 4 times. Then, when we get to the end of the lesson, after the grammar, which is about first conditional and time clauses, we ask them to do grammar exercises, but again it revises the vocabulary as well. So they have to put in the correct form. Is it will plus infinitive or the present simple? And they have to choose the correct form, and they have to choose if it's make and do. And also in the listening, which is on in exercise 3, there are lots of these make and do expressions built into the listening as well. So by the end of the lesson, they've probably seen all the vocabulary 6 times, so it's built in throughout the lesson. But recycling doesn't end there. In the next lesson, students begin with a quick review. You may know in face-to-face we start every lesson with a quick review that revises key language from the previous lesson in a fun, student-centered kind of way. So here they have to write 4 phrases with make and do that are connected to them or people they know. Then they tell their partner why they chose the phrases, as in the example. Then, at the end of the unit, we have our extra practice page, and they can do another gap fill to practice that as well. And then, if the teacher chooses, she can do this fun activity from the photocopyable section of the teacher's book. Here, first students have to fill in the gaps with the correct form of make and do, then decide if the sentences is true for men or women. For example, what do we fill in the gap in circle 8 here? What's the answer? Can't see. Okay, men or women find it more difficult to admit they have a mistake than men or women. Okay, the correct answer is coming up now, made. So they have made, because it's present perfect. And what do you think? Do you think the answer should be men find it more difficult to admit they've made a mistake, or women find it more difficult to admit they've made a mistake? Okay, so men, of course, says Genevieve. Apologies for the pronunciation if I got that wrong. Okay, interesting. Men find it more difficult. I'm not sure about that. Seems most of you think the answer should be men. I'm not sure that's right, but maybe I'm wrong, and maybe I find it difficult to admit I've made a mistake. Anyway, after that, women are prevailing in this webinar, says Anna. Exactly. Ah, so it is men. And women. Okay, this is turning into quite a discussion. Okay, after that, of course, students can do more practice in the workbooks or the exercises on the self-study DVD-ROM, which means by the end of it, they'll have used the phrases at least 9 or 10 times. And we tried really hard to build in this kind of recycling throughout face-to-face because we feel it's absolutely essential for successful learning. Okay, finally I'd like to talk about a few vocabulary revision activities that I feel are useful, because I think that we need to revise new vocabulary later on in the course to check students haven't forgotten them. So here are some of my favourite vocabulary revision activities that I use in class. Okay, the first one's very simple, but it's something I do all the time. After the break, when the students come back after a break, just ask them to write down all the vocabulary that you did at the beginning of the class that they can remember, and give them a time limit of, say, 1 minute. Students like the competition, and as we've discussed, this kind of memory activity really helps students move new vocabulary from their short-term memory to their long-term memory. So just getting them to recall the vocabulary again is really useful. So after the break, always a good thing to do. An alternative way of giving them another memory activity is to use vocabulary you've already written on the board. Okay, you may remember this lexical set from earlier in the webinar on computer vocabulary. So I'll just give you a few seconds to look at this and try and remember it. Okay, you remembering those words? Where, and also remember where they are on the board is also very important. Try not to write them down. Yes, don't write them down. Actually, not try not to write them down, just don't write them down. Just try and remember where they are. Okay. Right. Now, I'd like to ask you to close your eyes. Eyes closed. Okay, open your eyes again. Which 3 words or phrases are missing? Okay, hard drive is one, virus another. So everyone's got a hard drive and virus. Ah, there's a third one coming up. Okay, crash. Oh my God, someone says. So virus, hard drive, crash. Now password's still there. Okay. Right. Okay, now can you close your eyes again? Okay, someone in Brazil hasn't closed their eyes, I think. Okay, close your eyes. Okay, open them again. Which other 3 words or phrases are missing? Okay. Okay, good. We've got backup, scan, memory stick. Now, scan's still there. Okay, backup, memory stick, and scan. Okay, so you continue rubbing these words off the board until it's blank. And then you can ask students to work in pairs and write down all the words in the correct order. And again, this is just fixing the words in their mind, and it's a really good sort of 3-5 minute activity that can really exploit vocabulary you've written on the board. Okay. Here's another kind of format that I often use. This example is from the book, but it's something that you can adapt to kind of any vocabulary. Okay, you remember the lesson we did on birthdays where we teach verb patterns? Well, this is a quick review in the next lesson. As you see, we often review vocabulary at the beginning of the next lesson, as this is a really good way to start the class. So here we ask students to think of one thing they love doing, often forget to do, etc. Then they tell their partners their ideas and ask more questions. So getting students to think of one thing they ... can work for any type of vocabulary. As I say, in face-to-face, this is done for you in the book, but you can adapt this to any other type of vocabulary. And the next one is something I use all the time. If you don't use it, it's one of the best things to have up your sleeve. Personalized questions, as we've seen, are a very good way to practice vocabulary. So this is a final speaking activity where we ask students to write questions about people's routines. So if you're stuck for a vocabulary practice idea, writing questions, and in this you may notice we direct them back to exercise 1A. And in exercise 1A you have the vocabulary on the page. This incidentally is why we always have the vocabulary in the lesson, not just in the back of the book. So students can refer to it when they need it. Then they ask the other students the questions to find out who does the same thing as you. Okay, the next one is finding differences or things in common. Here's a very simple example from our starter. Okay, this practices vocabulary for abilities, where students work in pairs and find 4 things you can do but your partner can't do. So I can swim, I can dance, I can play tennis, etc. So you can use this kind of format for practically any type of vocabulary. Also, you can use the alternative, which is find things in common. So find 4 things you can both do. So this is the kind of thing you can use this format with almost any area of vocabulary or grammar. For example, find 3 things you do in your free time your partner doesn't do. Find 4 things you eat your partner never eats. Find 3 things you both like doing at the weekend. And is a great one to have up your sleeve for a few minutes at the end of a class. Never fails, this one. Okay, if you want to review lots of vocabulary from the whole week, here's another format that I've used quite a lot. I call it know, don't know, might know. Here you write some vocabulary you've taught in the last 2 weeks on the board or on a handout. Students then write them in 3 boxes. Vocabulary they definitely know, vocabulary they think they know, and vocabulary they don't know. So here I've used examples of the vocabulary, the phrasal verbs we did earlier. So I definitely know check in and check out. I might know get around, set off. I don't remember that one. I should do it. I wrote the book, but there you go. Then when they finished putting the words in groups, they work in pairs or with a group of students and compare their answers. And this is where the magic happens. This is where students teach each other the words they don't know. And of course, you can help them with the rest. And actually, I think students teaching each other words they don't know is a really good way to help those students remember the words. I don't know about you, but I learned most of my English grammar by teaching it, not just by reading about it. Okay, another format, just to finish, that I often use, I call vocabulary giveaway. Let me explain how this works. Okay. First, you give students a few cards with new vocabulary written on. Give maybe 3 or 4 cards to each student. This is vocabulary you've done in the last couple of weeks. Then, students check the meaning of any vocabulary they don't know in the language summary, dictionary with yourself. So students need to know all the vocabulary on their cards. When they're all happy, they know all the meanings. Students have to move around the room and work in groups, or work in groups. And they take turns to ask each other for definitions or examples of vocabulary on their cards. So, for example, if student A has a card that says look forward to something and shows it to student B. If student B doesn't know what it means, he or she must take the card from student A. Because the aim of the game is to give away all your cards. So you have all your students in groups or in the whole class trying to give away the cards to people who don't know what it means. And of course, that they also have to receive all the cards, they don't know what it means. So this vocabulary giveaway activity is a really fun way at the end of the week to revise all the vocabulary in the class. Okay, there are some ideas. So just to sum up, before we get to questions, here are the key methodological points we've discussed. Okay, this is how we feel we can help our students really remember new vocabulary. Firstly, make the presentation stage student-centered if you can. Practice the vocabulary immediately after presentation. Make the practice activities personalized and communicative. Include quick memory games to help it stick. Try and recycle vocabulary in the rest of the lesson through readings, listening, practice activities, grammar practice activities particularly, speaking activities, etc. So recycling is really important. And hopefully the book is doing that for you to a great extent. Try and practice the vocabulary at the beginning of the next lesson. And do a lot of vocabulary review activities. And of course, we've tried to incorporate all these principles in a new edition of Face to Face. Okay, I'd like to finish with a quote that I always use on teacher training courses when I ran CELTA courses, etc., to encourage teachers to make their lessons more student-centered. It's an ancient American Indian quote. Tell me, and I'll forget. Show me, and I may not remember. Involve me, and I'll understand. Okay, right, just before I answer your questions, and now if you have any questions for me, please send them through, and my colleagues here will pick them up. I just want to publicise some other webinars that are coming up shortly. Next Tuesday, at the same time, there's a webinar focusing on language in English for academic purposes by the author Craig Thane. So if you teach any academic English, make sure you tune in for that one. On Tuesday, February the 4th, is the next face-to-face webinar, which is about making the most out of online workbooks. This is a webinar by Deirdre Cyphers and Ricardo Morales. I won't be here then, I'm afraid, because I'm going to be on my honeymoon. Me and my dear wife, we're going to Costa Rica for 3 weeks. We actually got married last May, but we've been so busy we haven't had time for a honeymoon. So some people are taking over for me at the next one, making the most of online workbooks, particularly looking at the new face-to-face online workbooks and how you can help, how these can help you to incorporate the online workbooks into your classes and with your students. I'll be back on March the 4th, hopefully with a suntan, and I'll be talking about helping students with speaking and helping them get it right. So that's another face-to-face based webinar on Tuesday, March the 4th at 3 o'clock. Okay, so those are the webinars coming up. And thank you for all the nice comments about getting married. Congratulations. I saw Natalia, thank you. And all the thank you. Yes, it's certainly looking forward to the honeymoon. It probably won't be as stressful as organising a wedding while writing 5 books at the same time. Okay, so I'd like to thank you, Marta, for your comments as well, Barcelona, Cambridge office. And if we have any questions?
Okay, so the first question we've got is quite general, actually, but it's from Duma Mambalo in Senegal, who's wondering if you have any other sort of very quick wins for getting students fluency up in English.
For getting students fluency up, well, that's an interesting question, and I think it's something I'm probably going to talk more about in my next webinar on March the 4th, the one on screen at the moment, which is about helping students with speaking, where I'll be looking particularly about helping students be accurate, but also increase their fluency as well. And so I think, if you don't mind, I'll kind of leave those tips for the next webinar when we're really talking about speaking, because, well, obviously, vocabulary is important for speaking. Fluency is more to do with the speaking skill than remembering vocabulary. So give you a reason to tune in on March the 4th for that one.
Okay, Chris, I think you've actually possibly answered everyone's questions already in the webinar, and everyone's noting down the tips that you've given them, because we do have another question.
Just a note on that, actually, before we get to the question. A couple of things of how can we remember all these ideas. That, as I said before, this will be available. This webinar is available to see again on the catch-up page on the face-to-face or Cambridge website. I'm not exactly sure of the URL, but if you wanted to see it again and maybe fast forward to the end and see the ideas, then you'll be able to do so. Okay.
Sorry. Yeah. So we've got some more questions coming in now. One from Robert Kennedy. Without students' over-dependence on smartphones and tablets, are there plans for mobile-compatible versions of these textbooks?
There are certainly plans which we're working on right at the moment to have ebook versions of the books. Although we're kind of in the kind of writing planning stage of that at the moment. So the short answer is there will certainly be some digital versions of these books. How much there'll be just for mobile phones, I'm not sure, because obviously with the amount of content we have, actually my wife designs websites, and she's currently working on some projects, and the issues of making the same material visible on a laptop or a computer and also on an iPad or a mobile phone is a complicated business. So there are certainly plans to have some digital components coming out, hopefully by the beginning of next year. Whether they'll be mobile phone compatible, I can't honestly answer at the moment. I agree, mobile phones are the future. We should embrace them, as someone has just commented. Although we have to think, do we want our students all to be staring at their mobile phones during the class, or are we talking about things for them to do outside class? I think there's a distinction to be made there.
Okay, so a question from Jasmina Vukonyansky. Apologies, Jasmina. Questions about students using mobile and online dictionaries in class. And Jasmina particularly says, which is interesting, I think, I feel my students will forget how to use paper dictionaries. Do you think that's interesting?
To be honest, I've always had a bit of a problem with students using dictionaries in class unless it's very tightly guided, because if we look at the phrasal verbs we were looking at before, these set off and look forward to and get back and all the rest. When I used to get students looking at dictionaries in class and they say, oh, look at these verbs or phrases in the dictionary. Some students would get the right one, some will get a different meaning, some will go very quickly, some will take forever. So I find actually, in a sense, that's why in the back of face-to-face we have these mini dictionary boxes, because it only deals with the meaning that we're teaching in that particular lesson. So it means students don't have to wade through 5 different meanings of get back, for example, to find the one that you're talking about, and makes things much quicker. Having said that, I mean, I think generally students should be free to use any dictionary kind of almost whenever they like, if they're reading or listening and they don't know something. And mobile dictionaries and online dictionaries are, you know, whether we like it or not, becoming much more common. I think one of the advantages of them, they're often much quicker than flicking through a book. And as someone said, this is the future, and if we force them to always use paper dictionaries, maybe that's going to discourage them. So I would maybe cautiously sort of encourage them to use the online dictionaries. But I think if it's language that you're teaching, it's much easier and particularly quicker in the class. Because when I was teaching, I was always running out of time. So, and I found dictionary stages could take forever. So I think the kind of approach we have in face-to-face little dictionary boxes makes things speed up a lot quicker. Did that answer your question? I hope so.
Okay, so we've got a question now from Burhan Bakiri, who asks, is it a good idea to have a list of new vocabulary on the wall? And how about associating them with pictures, synonyms, antonyms, or with translation?
Yes, I think that's a very good idea. Well, I used to have actually, I didn't put them on the wall. I had a vocabulary bag that I used to pin on the wall. So every day I'd write all the new vocabulary of the day on little cards and put them in the bag. And so after a couple of weeks, there'd be, 100, 200 cards in there. And I'd use that all the time, particularly for little fillers, end of the class. So I get them to look in the bag, find 5 cards, check if everyone knows them, etc. Depending on the classroom, the other thing where I taught, we used to move classrooms all the time. So we couldn't really put them on the wall because, 8 different teachers were using them. But I think that's a very good thing to do if you have your own classroom all the time, is to put them on the wall. Associating with pictures, yes, this was another activity I used to do all the time. Was if you put lots of pictures around the wall, give them the vocabulary on cards, and they have to stick them with a picture that connects with them in some way. It doesn't have to be an obvious connection necessarily. It doesn't have to be kind of dog and here's a picture of a dog. Often it's much more interesting if the pictures don't connect with the vocabulary, obviously. Then students have to think of a reason to connect that. And then they can explain to someone else why they've put that vocabulary on that picture. So I agree, all those kind of activities are very, very good idea. And I think the vocabulary bag is something that if you start at the beginning of a course, at the end of the course, you can say, look, we've done all this vocabulary. And, and I actually found that in some classes, students who came in early, what they do is they go straight to the vocabulary bag, pick out some words, check if they knew them. So, yes, vocabulary bag. Maybe I should have put it in the talk, but thank you for reminding me.
Thanks. Another question now from Athanasia Mathurudi, who asks, how would you apply the ideas you suggested if we choose a task-based model?
That's a good question, because obviously task-based lessons have a very different format, and you're very much working from what the students need. And I think that, in a sense, it's much harder to gather together a set of vocabulary to revise next class, because each person or each group is probably going to need different ones. So the short answer is maybe it's hard to do that. Having said that, there may be most task-based lessons I did, or I've seen other people do, tend to be kind of semi-task-based, because in a sense you are guiding them to a certain extent, and you can predict what vocabulary they're going to need, and you will know what kind of language your students have or don't have. So you can maybe either at the beginning of the class predict what they need, or at the end of the class just make a note of which words people had asked you to feed into their task-based activity. But I think in a sense it's kind of up to the teacher to jot these down before you forget or move to another class, so you can revise them next time using one of the ways we discussed. Interesting point I've got through here is asking the students to write the paper slips for the vocabulary bag themselves, which is more student-centered, which again is a great idea, although you do need to check they have spelled them correctly. And if you really want to work with this, you can get them to put the meaning or an example on the back, which is another good way of doing it.
Okay, thanks. Another question now from Rafael Cortez-Luna, who asks, are repetitions really effective with new vocabulary, or can we get more by investing time in the activities that you've mentioned?
By repetitions, I presume you mean drilling? Well, I think that depending on the class, it depends where you are working and your level of your students. But I think that drilling is very useful. I don't think every single item of vocabulary needs to be drilled 5 times with every student. And I think it's particularly picking the ones that are going to be problematic, particularly ones that don't sound like they look, and drilling those is very important. So that's kind of making them pronounce it. But of course, I don't think drilling necessarily helps them remember it. So I think you need to do some drilling to get their pronunciation correct, and then you need to do all the revision and review and practice activities that we were discussing to help them remember it. So I would think keep the drilling stage relatively short and sweet and very snappy, and maybe just focus on the problem vocabularies. Then you might have more time for the memory and personalized practice activities that we discussed.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Got time for one more question from Sophia Cruz, who says, what can we suggest students do at home when studying vocabulary on their own?
Well, there's, of course, there's if they're using face-to-face or any other course for that matter, there's a workbook which will have vocabulary activities in. Actually, in the back of the face-to-face students book, the new self-study DVD-ROM has a fantastic new vocabulary revision activity, which is very similar to this know, don't know worksheet that I showed you earlier. Basically, they have all the vocabulary they can choose which units, and they put them into know, don't know boxes. And if you click on the word, it flips over and gives you a definition. So if you're using face-to-face, have a look at the vocabulary revision activities on the DVD-ROM. And having said that, of course, I always find that any kind of writing, if it's guided topic-wise, should get new vocabulary in the into the writing. So when I set writing, I always set them a language task as well. So, for example, write about your last holiday, but you must use at least 8 of these phrases in your writing. So they have to use the vocabulary that you taught. So yeah, I think the DVD-ROM has lots of other practice activities as well, and so I'd try and get them. I mean, if they can do all the workbook and all the exercises on the DVD-ROM, they'll have done a lot. So that's certainly a good place to start. Thank you also to Rosanna and Natalia and many other people for your kind comments about the course that's coming through. It's very nice to see. Thank you.
Yes, it's absolutely great to see how many of you are using face-to-face and really enjoying it and finding it very useful for your students. So thanks very much, Chris, for an absolutely fascinating session that, as you can see from the chat, people have really enjoyed. I'm very glad we'll be having you back quite a lot in the future for more webinars in this series. So obviously, as we said, Chris is back on March the 4th, and we've also got webinars coming up on February the 4th, making the most of online workbooks, and next week at this time on January the 21st on focusing on language and English for academic purposes. So you can sign up for all of those at on the news page on the Cambridge University Press site. So that's www.cambridge.org/ELT/news, and you can find recordings of all our webinars from Cambridge University Press on our catch-up page. I've posted the URL in the chat many times, but it's bit.ly, so bit.ly/CAMCATCHUP, and C in cam, C in catch, and U in up are all capitalized. But it's easier if you just just click on the link in the chat. So we'll be back in a week's time with Craig Bain, and Chris will be back after his honeymoon in March. Thanks very much, everybody. Particularly thanks, Chris, and we'll see you all again soon. Thanks very much. Bye.